I would like to introduce our first speaker for this evening, Mercedes Lee. Mercedes is an organizer for No One is Illegal Toronto, a multi-ethnic migrant justice movement rooted in anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, ecological justice, Indigenous self-determination, anti-occupation, and anti-oppressive politics. Mercedes, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. In 2004, armed immigration officers entered Dante Alighieri High School in North Toronto. You can flip the slide, please. They walked into 16-year-old Kimberly Lozano Sosa's classroom and arrested her. They went into her 14-year-old brother Gerald's homeroom and arrested him. Kimberly and Gerald were dragged out from their classroom and thrown into a van. In the van already was their mother, their grandmother, and their Canadian-born baby sister. Students who saw this arrest were terrified and enraged. Quickly, a few of them got online and eventually made contact with us at No One is Illegal Toronto. A few hours later, members of our collective showed up at the school. Teachers, students, and parents had gathered together. They wanted to do something. Together, we decided to organize a demonstration outside of the prison, the jail where the children were being imprisoned. Hundreds of people showed up outside the Immigration Detention Center in Rexdale, Toronto. We organized an even bigger rally the day after. With the news of these daylight arrests on the front pages of newspapers across the country, and immense mobilizing underway, the federal government moved into damage control mode. Kimberly and Gerald and their family were released from prison. As Kimberly stepped out in front of her supporters and dozens of TV cameras, a reporter asked her, "How do you feel?" And Kimberly responded, "It's not just about me. There are all these children inside that prison. Why aren't they in school?" With these few simple words, unknowingly, to her or to us, Kimberly launched a campaign and a movement that continues today, 14 years later. With Kimberly and Gerald and their classmates and hundreds of other Torontonians, we went to the Toronto District School Board and asked for changes. We demanded that the school board create policies to ensure that undocumented students could access schools without fear and immigration enforcement not be allowed to enter into schools. Next slide. This is the first lesson I want to share with you. Sanctuary zones are about shutting out immigration enforcement and about creating real and effective policies that allow people to access essential services and live lives of dignity and without fear. The school board initially resisted our campaign. That year, Kimberly and Gerald led a march of 5,000 people down Bloor Street in Toronto, calling for immigration justice. The school board trustees insisted to us that they were afraid to tell school board staff to break laws. As we explained to them over and over, their jobs are not to enforce federal immigration policy. The job of the school board is to deliver education. With the school board refusing to discuss the issue, parents, teachers, students, and supporters began weekly protests outside school board headquarters. Faced with this constant pressure, the school board eventually decided to at least debate the motion. School board trustees, noting that public sentiment was not in their favor, voted unanimously to make Toronto schools accessible to undocumented students and to refuse to allow immigration enforcement into schools. Immigration enforcement, which had initially defended its actions, issued a statement saying they would not enter schools. Next slide, please. And the slide after that. So this is our second lesson. Mass mobilizations and direct action are the only way to win real change. In the years that followed, we did a series of such campaigns. When Garcia was facing deportation and being turned away from anti-violence against women's shelters, we launched a campaign called Shelter Sanctuary Status. As a result of our mobilizing of shelter residents and feminist activists, immigration enforcement passed a policy barring themselves from all spaces that serve survivors of violence, gender-based violence. Though this policy was later reneged by the government, dozens of anti-violence against women's spaces passed policies to turn away immigration enforcement and give shelter to undocumented women and their families. We went into food banks, where police went in on behalf of immigration enforcement and arrested an undocumented woman who was trying to get food for her family. We campaigned to get undocumented families access to food banks and ban immigration enforcement from entering in. Next slide, please. This is our third lesson. Next slide. We must be led by the needs of our communities. Every one of our campaigns emerged out of a specific incident where undocumented people were targeted, and all of them were led in part by undocumented families themselves. And because they had immediate material needs, many of these campaigns succeeded because they impacted the lives of people. As a result of nearly a decade of such campaigns, the level of awareness and support for access to services in Toronto, and in fact across the country, was at an all-time high. Next slide. In late 2012, a committee of Toronto City Council commissioned a report on the state of undocumented and immigrant people in the city. The committee reached out to No One is Illegal Toronto and asked us if we had any recommendations following the report. It might be surprising to some of you that we initially refused to participate. The reason was there wasn't sufficient grassroots support for such a position, and because there were very few city services that undocumented families were telling us that they needed. Top-down policies we knew never last. We spent the next few months consulting with our communities to find out their needs and priorities. In early 2013, when the committee re-met, we put forward our demands to them. We asked for, 1, a full training of all city staff and volunteers on issues of immigration rights and access to services for city residents. It's important to note that we were not just doing this sensitivity training, but asking for the city to explain to its staff why people are forced to leave their homes and how federal laws exclude and deny people on the basis of their status. We asked for a change in all forms so that undocumented people were not asked for information they would be afraid to share. We asked for outreach and advertising in immigrant communities so that undocumented people were aware of these changes. We asked that all city services be available to undocumented residents. We asked for all city agencies to cut ties with federal immigration enforcement. We asked for the city to request the province to make all services accessible to undocumented people. And we asked the city to ask the federal government to give permanent resident status to all undocumented people. Finally, we asked the city to compel the staff to report back each year with progress on this motion. Now, you have to remember that this was City Council controlled by Conservative Rob Ford before the scandals broke out. We began an intense period of lobbying, getting churches, food banks, shelters, all of the spaces we had organized in to reach out to councillors. A few short months later, Toronto City Council voted almost unanimously for what we had campaigned for, with a few minor but still substantial changes. As you can see, we were asking for a comprehensive policy, one that actually ensured real changes for the lives of people and that understood that change needed to happen at every level. The summer after the policy was passed in 2013, we initiated our own audit of city services to see if the policy was implemented. We didn't wait for the city at all. Next slide. So from our years of work prior to 2013, we had learned our fourth lesson. Policy is not worth the paper that it's printed on without people power behind it in trying to implement it. Our study released in December 2013 found that fully 25% of the city-funded and city-administered services were completely inaccessible to undocumented people. That is, when called, staff refused to provide services to undocumented residents. But in addition, another 60% were inaccessible because they were asked for documents that undocumented residents would not have. That is, while service providers may want to serve undocumented residents without adequate training and changes in protocols, they were continuing to deny services, often without being aware that they were doing so. So now may be a good time to note that No One is Illegal Toronto is a volunteer organization. We have no staff, no office, no phone line, and almost no funding. And we had positioned ourselves as a watchdog trying to get the city to keep its word. Once the media spotlight was gone, and without an organization regularly keeping the city's feet to the fire, the policy was barely implemented. Next slide. We had seen the same thing at school boards. Remember how I started talking about the TDSB victory back in 2004? Today, 14 years later, TDSB school boards admission forms still ask for immigration status documents. This is despite the Ontario Education Act clearly stating that education should be available regardless of status documents. It is a lesson we have learned over and over. Laws and policies are passed but rarely implemented in ways that produce real change. We must change the entire culture of our communities, of our lived lives before governments will catch on. We don't know about Ajax, and we're hoping that you can tell us in the questions and answers how things are working here. So this is why, for these reasons, in 2013, immediately after the policy was passed, we embarked on two new projects. One is that we went back to shelters, food banks, schools, service centers, and we began trainings and information sessions with them in order for them to become safe zones, to self-organize as safe zones for people without status. This was irrespective of whether they were funded by the city or not. Next slide. So this is our fifth lesson. Access without fear or sanctuary is not about government policy, ultimately. It's a culture of solidarity, where each of us works to ensure that everyone in our community can get basic services, rights, and dignity. This is work that we are continuing today. What's amazing about these projects and initiatives is that it's about self-determination. Teachers, nurses, frontline service providers, school administrators, bank clerks, childcare workers are all refusing to follow unjust laws and policies. We've created a step-by-step approach for organizations and agencies to make themselves safe zones. What's remarkable about these workshops is when we go into these places, we're not just talking about access for undocumented people. We talk about ensuring access for all people, people with disabilities. We talk about ensuring access for women, queer, trans, and racialized people. We talk about ensuring safety and dignity in terms of the relationships between staff and the people who use the space. To us, the work of sanctuary, and it's important to note that we term our work as access without fear policies in a solidarity city approach, is about transformation. It's about building the world that we want to be living in. In these places, we are not just talking about access to services. We are talking about why people are forced to leave their homes and immigrate in the first place, and how we in Canada profit from that displacement. We are talking about colonialism and how immigration laws are illegitimate in a country which continues to occupy Indigenous territory. These workshops are both practical and pragmatic and grounded in the sense that we ask deep questions and arrive at the answers together. We look at where information needs to be shared. Next slide. Training for volunteers, appropriate protocols, etc. So for example, in a food bank or shelter, we discuss what is public space, where immigration enforcement can walk in and what's not. We are happy, we want to come to you and connect with any organization trying to do this work afterwards. So please reach out to us. The second thing that we have been doing is we have been taking this model and method of grassroots-based, directly affectionate people-led, solidarity-centric organizing and sharing it with other cities. So we've connected with people in Hamilton, in Montreal, in Ottawa, Guelph, Vancouver, and today, of course, in Ajax, and working with them as they've tried to create municipal policies or win changes at the level of agencies or conducted public education. Next slide. This is our sixth lesson. What started at a grassroots level, built up slowly with lessons learned the hard way, has to be shared. We have to encourage as many people as possible across the country to build safe zones for undocumented people in their cities, and which shut out immigration enforcement. City policies are important in terms of emergency shelters or city-funded childcare or policing, but more often than not, cities pass the buck onto the province. Case in point would be the Toronto Police Services. While the TPS is entirely funded by city resources, they are governed by provincial legislation. The provincial law says that Toronto Police may call immigration enforcement. The police in Toronto generally interpret this as that they should act like they are in fact federal immigration enforcement. So not only does the police call immigration enforcement where there is a warrant, we found through our research that Toronto Police was calling immigration enforcement 100 times every week because they were suspicious that someone was undocumented. I don't know about you, I don't know how you determine just from looking at someone or passing them whether or not they may be undocumented. So what that means is the police saw someone, saw that there was no warrant for them, but called CBSA, the Canada Border Services Agency, just to be sure that the person was not undocumented. This is, of course, another way of saying that they were racially profiling. As you can imagine, next slide, the people that these calls are being made for are largely racialized and people with accents. Next slide. So this has been our 7th lesson. It has been difficult to create effective police oversight. Through changes to legislation and organizing, we can create mechanisms to prevent the police from doing the work, preventing municipal police of doing the work of federal immigration enforcement. So our work has to be about cultural change and about transforming a society, transforming society in a way that immigrants are not dehumanized. Because ultimately that is what we are talking about. The idea that someone can be denied basic services simply because they didn't do the right paperwork. But our work is also much broader than this. Next slide. While we are fighting for services for undocumented people, we know that there is a very simple solution to all of this. The federal government could tomorrow regularize, which means give permanent resident status, to all undocumented and migrant workers and their families in Canada. We call this proposal, and it's quite simple, status for all. And it's been done many times before in Canada and in other countries around the world. Between 1980 and 2004, Canada created 7 regularization programs by which large groups of undocumented people were given permanent residency status. Most recently, this took place in 2002 when nearly 1,000 non-status Algerians were given status. In May of 2005, Spain gave status to over 700,000 people. This is a very simple solution with widespread ramifications. Not only is it practical, it insists on a world where people are not excluded. We believe that such a program should be developed not just for Canadian economic interests, but with clear respect for Indigenous self-determination, for it is on their lands that we live on. Next slide. Our 8th lesson is that sanctuary is but a step towards the creation of a just society, founded on the principles of inclusion, not exclusion, and under the umbrella of status for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mercedes, very much. Your presentation has highlighted the historical moments, movements, and lessons learned over these last 14 years or so, and you've given a name and a face to that too by telling us some very personal stories of people that you've been involved with. As you look into the future, you've talked about the status for all as perhaps a next policy change. Do you see other policy changes, activities on the horizon coming within our Canadian context?
I think when we talk about the Canadian context, I think I always want to bring it back to the fact that we want to situate this Canadian context within this knowledge that Canada exists and occupies Indigenous lands and repeatedly denies Indigenous treaties and Indigenous self-determination. So any conversation about sanctuary, solidarity, always has to exist with that in mind. Yeah. I think that in terms of moving ahead, I think what we've shown through the various examples and stories that I was mentioning is that moving ahead, there's a lot that can be done right now. And what we're doing right now is, and what all of us can do right now, is create spaces in our communities so that to create right now the world that we want to live in, which is where people can access services and where we don't wait for policies to change. We don't wait for the government to decide that status for all is something that they want to put on the agenda, but that where people can go and move and work and live and exist in their communities without fear of not being denied the services that everyone else should have. And I think that's something that all of us can be doing right now and should be doing in our day-to-day lives.